Welcome everyone this evening. Nice to see so many familiar faces in the audience. Alexandra's here? Where's Alexandra? Okay, she's back there. So thank you all for being here with us tonight. We're really thrilled to have Alexandra Borchardt, who's going to be speaking on the topic of democracy and journalism. We're really looking forward to hearing what she has to say. I know that many of you have just come back from the Perugia International Journalism Festival over the weekend. What a great opportunity to be able to take advantage of all of the varied panels that they have there. So we'll be continuing the discussion this evening about a lot of the important issues that were raised in the festival as well. So I'm sure that you guys are going to have a lot of great questions. Thank you to Professor Gianluca Squeo for organizing this evening's dialogue, and now I will hand it over to him.
Thank you, Megan. Good evening, everybody. For those who don't know me, I am Lucas Gueo. I teach here a course on media activism and democracy. When we are thinking about this event with Megan earlier this year, we thought we should have a talk that could combine two elements: the activism, so civil society, also someone who could explain us the challenges of contemporary journalism. And that's we searched a bit. Then we decided to invite Alexandra Borchardt. I know that the pronunciation is not probably correctly German. She is German, based now in Oxford, where she runs a very interesting program. You will tell us a little bit about it. And she will start with a presentation about a few topics that I think are interesting for us concerning trust in the media and also the evolving role of journalists. And then we can start our discussion. So thank you very much for being here. I'll leave you the floor.
Yes, thank you so much, Gianluca, for inviting me. And yes, when I read in this little outline about this talk that this is about activism and journalism, I felt like, what is it really about activism? But actually, we can talk about activism a lot later on, but you can't understand the connection or the tension between activism and journalism if you don't understand the challenges that journalism has to face. So I'll just, show you a little bit of our material, a little bit of our research, and about the latest developments in journalism, and then I'm happy to discuss everything and give you my point of view on this. So journalism and democracy, it's probably the other way around. Let's see. Now this works. Yeah, this is what we are, really briefly. I work in this lovely building. We do comparative journalism research. We have about 10 research fellows who do research. We have been running a journalist fellowship program for 35 years. This is for mid-career journalists who sort of take a break and come to us for 3 to 6 months. And what I'm doing, what I'm responsible for is the part of, basically you can call it executive education for senior media leaders and senior journalists. And we also do some sort of policy support. Yes, and let's dive right into the subject, how digitalization has affected media. And there are many trends, and I'll sum them up quite briefly because I'm sure you encountered all these trends one way or the other in your studies, but still they need to be mentioned. And the first trend is that media and journalism has developed from bundled and curated to distributed news. You all know that journalism used to be bundled in a newspaper, in a broadcasting program, on TV or radio, and now it's just taken apart, it's distributed on search, social media, so that's a big trend that affects how people consume news. It's from anchor to everywhere. You used to read the newspaper in the train or at the breakfast table, or you sat in front of the TV at night. Now you access news everywhere. Basically, you can access news 24 hours a day. Many people access news first thing in the morning when they wake up, or at least they grab their smartphones. From broadcasted to participatory. That's a really important challenge, and it can be quite annoying for newsrooms that, these journalists used to be like up there, telling the other people how the world is run and how it's supposed to be run. And then, they leaned back and said, well, if you're not happy, you can write a letter to the editor. Well, not any longer. You all know the world has changed, and you can respond and discuss and post everything all the time. So actually there needs to be a dialogue, and newsrooms, some newsrooms had a very hard time getting used to this, but participatory journalism is also a big opportunity. We'll get to that later. From decentralized and local to centralized and global. Local journalism used to be for many people was the only access to journalism. And actually, local journalism was thriving also because of all the advertising in the local space. Now local journalism is in decline, particularly because of business models are challenged. And you can actually, theoretically, you can publish your stuff worldwide, depending on what kind of language you publish in. So if you publish in English, it's actually, on the one hand, a big opportunity, but also a big challenge because your competition is increasing so much stronger. That's a really important one, from must-have to nice-to-have. If you wanted to be informed about the world, if you wanted to be informed about, the candidates who run for the next elections, you actually had to buy a newspaper in earlier times, and you had to watch the evening news, or you had to really, you just had a few products you could really rely on. Now, news has become so much more a nice-to-have product, so it's more like a consumer product these days, because there's so many distractions, there's so much information out there, there's all this other content floating around. So really, news organizations have to put much greater effort into attracting you to the stuff they are doing, and that has shaped journalism. And also, and this is the last one of these, from human-produced to artificial intelligence, AI produced, and that's going to happen in the next decade. Lots of journalism is going to move from human-centered to AI-produced, not only because algorithms tend to do the selection these days about what's shown to you in your timelines, but also bots will produce some of the, the daily reporting. They already do reporting, sports results, business news, earnings results, weather forecast. This is all stuff that has been taken over by bots in some news agencies already, and it's going to happen much more in the next coming years. Yes, now let's look at some data about news consumption that illustrates some of the trends that I just mentioned. The data I have here is from our digital news report. That's the world's largest ongoing survey on digital news consumption, online news consumption behavior. It covers 37 markets, and 74,000 respondents respond to this survey every year. That's every year done in end of February, beginning of January. So this is from the 2018 report. The next one will be out in June, so can look forward to that. And what we found in our digital news report last year, that actually the way people access news, it's only 1/3 that was last year, access news directly by going to websites or going to some, to media outlets. But 2/3 actually also already access news access news through site door access, so through search and social. And that makes a big difference because, as you know, search and social, the news is, as I said earlier, distributed, no longer bundled in one product, so you have a completely different access to the news environment. And here you can see that's split up by age groups, and obviously you can see this is a generational thing. I don't know how many of you still access news by going through particular websites, and how many, maybe you can discuss that later, but you see it's going to change massively in the next years to come. And it's not only young people, you can see that it's also older generations who access news through site door access. Here you can see that actually accessing news through social media, accessing news through Facebook was somewhat down last year because Facebook for many people got less attractive, overbearing. They also felt that it was just too open and it was too obvious what everybody was posting and reading, so people got a little bit overwhelmed by Facebook and preferred much more to resort to other news channels or other distributive channels, which is a trend that can be a little bit worrisome, that news is moving more to closed networks like WhatsApp, for example. And I mean, here are the reasons for the shift. Facebook itself did changes to algorithm because Mark Zuckerberg and his managers decided that news is really a tricky subject for them, so they didn't want to bother with that too much longer. People got a little bit bored of Facebook, and the alternatives seem to be more interesting. And here you can see, and that has something to do with the topic tonight also, why people tend to move to closed networks like WhatsApp. It is a function of the political stability or the political pressures in a particular regime. Because you can see that whereas in the US or in Norway, people don't have a problem posting stuff on Facebook because there's no retributions. In other markets like Turkey, Malaysia, or Hong Kong, or you can see that people are much more cautious posting stuff, so they share stuff through WhatsApp, which also means, though, that a closed network is really much harder to access for journalists or for other actors in society, because you don't know what kind of stuff is shared there. All these kind of conspiracy theories or particularly politically slanted news is shared through WhatsApp groups. And a journalist fellow of ours from India, she just did a fascinating study. She got access to quite a few Facebook groups and monitored what was going on there. And it's actually really scary how much political content, hate speech or stuff is sort of hidden in these WhatsApp groups that are not out in the open. So there's two sides to it. You can share information more safely, but also it's a way of advocating hate speech or conspiracy theories. So I already mentioned the trends, how digitalization affects media. How does it challenge media? What is so difficult, or what has gotten to be so difficult for media? I mean, first of all, and you know all this, it's been a challenge to business models. Business model used to be lots of this stuff, lots of media organizations were financed for more than 50% at least by advertising. Not any longer, because huge chunks of the advertising market, about 80%, went to Facebook and Google alone. That has affected particularly local news organizations. And whereas the big ones have been able to sort of rechannel their income sources and make subscribers pay, make the customers pay a little more, many news organizations don't have that capacity, or at least are struggling hard because there's so much on the market, so much competition, news competition on the market, that it's hard to ask for subscriptions and money. Challenge for independence. I already mentioned these platform companies quite a bit. And it is a huge challenge for independence of journalism if you depend on others, on other platforms to distribute your stuff, because actually you can't really affect their, for example, programming algorithms, so what kind of rules they have, how they distribute news. If they say, oh, let's, we'll promote video, newsrooms run to produce video, then next year they say, oh, podcast is much nicer, then you have to lay off your video team and have a podcast team, whatsoever. So in many news organizations, there's lots of insecurity, lots of confusion. What kind of channels are the ones that work, and who actually is at home here? Who's calling the ropes? Who's deciding what you have to focus on? Is it the newsroom? Is it the particular media organization? Or is it a powerful platform company and you're just sort of running to catch up? Challenge for trust, and I'll show you some numbers in a minute. It's a big challenge. You all know that. Audiences increasingly have called the competencies of media organizations into question. They feel they can't trust among all these different news, all these different sources of information they see. They don't really know who to trust any longer, and that's obviously a big challenge. And obviously, it's also a challenge for technology. I mean, it used to be pretty clear-cut what kind of technology news organizations had to be good in. They had to be good into running printing presses and logistics, distribution, or they had to be good in broadcasting. Now that technology is evolving so rapidly, obviously you have more opportunities to use these technologies for storytelling, for all kinds of things, for distribution, for monitoring your audience behavior. But also it's hard to catch up, so you have to invest a lot. And as you can see, in times where business models are challenged and then the need arises that you have to invest a lot, there's quite some tension there. And it's a challenge for management. In news organizations, all the processes that were in place used to be really, really stable. Why? Because news situations were changing constantly. So if you have constantly changing news situations, you better have a really stable process running how to cope with this. Actually, I worked for 25 years, more than 25 years in newsrooms, all in daily journalism. I worked for the German press agency, for Financial Times Germany, and for Süddeutsche Zeitung in Munich. And I mean, it's just amazing how much you can do when you really know, when everybody knows what they have to do, and something happens, some act of terrorism, whatever, some major catastrophe. It's really amazing how much you can achieve in a very short time period. But if at the same time you have to constantly sort of change your approach, what kind of products are we using, what kind of strategy, if there's all these overlaying management challenges or changes, then it's getting very confusing for the newsroom, for the people involved in it. So that's a major source of distraction, and that really drives lots of people in great insecurity, and lots of people even in burnout in newsrooms. So it is a challenge for management. Management has to be much better and much more capable these days than they used to be. And it's a challenge for talent. And Gianluca and I were just talking about this because this is a major research project I'm currently running. With all these challenges, with all these things happening, who wants to become even a journalist these days? And I can hear that all over the world. In fact, I was in China last year in December, and I learned in China that only 1/3 of the people who go to journalism school just want to be journalists. The other ones want to go to join big platform companies. They want to do something that's less exhausting or less politically critical. I mean, that's the thing in China, but also everywhere else, because working conditions get worse, job prospects get worse. So you really have to want to be a journalist these days. And this is a real challenge, because if you have a diminishing pool of talent and you demand more and more and more, what can you do for the people who are really committed and who feel like they have a mission to really retain your staff? So that's a big challenge. Trust in news. I want to show you a few numbers we do on trust, and I think This is probably the slide I show most in all the talks I'm giving everywhere, and it's still very interesting. Yeah, let's see. Yeah, I pulled out the two already. So in our digital news report last year, we saw that 44% trust in news overall. You could ask, is that a lot? 44%? Sounds not too bad. You can also turn it on its head, and then you would come up with, 56% don't necessarily trust in news. Some might not know. So is this a good number? Is the glass half full or is it half empty? You just don't know. And what I find puzzling is actually the 51%, because 51%, only 51% trust in the news that they themselves use. So if you really like one particular newspaper and you just or you go to one particular website or one source, why would you do that if you didn't trust it? To be sure, 100% trust wouldn't be something to aspire to. That's actually something that's just, for authoritarian regimes. If you ask in an authoritarian regime, do you trust the media? People would say, yeah, sure, I do, because they are too scared to. So a healthy skepticism is really important. And having been in news organizations all my life, I know that there's mistakes, there's stuff going on. So it's actually good to be skeptical. Like for example, my husband, when he looks at these infographics and then he's like, oh, this can't be. He's an engineer by training, and he always looks at the numbers first and says, oh, isn't this a wrong number? And then, once in a while, yeah, unfortunately he was right. So a healthy skepticism is good, but still, yeah, you should at least be above the 50% line. And I'd really hope that this figure could be improved by doing better journalism. And it's really not much of a consolation that trust in news that you get through search, Google and the like, is even much lower. Because also, if you access search, you also access news on search. And if you have generally a low level of trust in search, then you might not trust the news that you find in search, even if it's from like the BBC or, La Repubblica or any other, the New York Times. You might not be really very trusting because you feel like, how do I know that this is the right thing that I get there, that this is the right thing? And this is actually even worse. Only 1 in 4 people trusts the news that they get from social media. So remember that thing we had before, that actually many people access news through this side door access, 2/3 was it? If they don't trust the news, then we have a serious problem here. Yeah, and this explains about the news in general. That's the trust in mainstream media and the sources people use, and the other trust figures are in the distributed environment. So you can see why trust is actually going down, because news is much more distributed. Yeah, and here you can see trust in different types of news outlets. You see that public service media has a fairly high amount of trust in most markets, not necessarily in some countries like Hungary, for example, where it's pretty much government controlled. The Spanish case I can't really explain too well, but usually trust in public service media tends to be higher than in other outlets. And here you can see, of all the markets, I pulled that out, how trust actually varies. But that's not the trust in news media, but that is something like, this is trust actually whether online news is real or fake. That's the whole debate on misinformation. We at the Institute actually, we don't want to call it fake news, we call it misinformation. And here you can see that there's a pretty big variety. There are some countries, for example, Germany, where I'm from, or also in Denmark or in Norway, where, you know, the concern about misinformation is not really that great, but you have to consider the sample was taken before certain elections and after certain elections, and particularly Brazil here, up here, the concern about misinformation was really huge. Because people felt like, you know, is the information that I'm getting, is this real or fake? But this is something that's also very important to consider, and this is important to remember when we talk activism later on. Audiences really define misinformation very different from what journalists might define it. And actually, the question to the participants of the survey was, what type of fake news were you exposed to in the past? Was it in the past week? I don't remember, I think in the past week. And actually, 42% said, oh, I was exposed to poor journalism, to mistakes, to clickbait. I see this every week. So this is not really what we think is misinformation, like, you know, really made up news, lies, whatever, that like that Hillary Clinton is running a callboy thing. No, this is just poor journalism. And I always tell my audiences, this is good news, actually, if I'm speaking to journalists, because this is the part that you can affect. You can do better journalism. You can work on that. You can make less mistakes, correct your mistakes. You can really do something against clickbait. You can improve your journalism. It's actually much better, much easier to improve your journalism than to run and debunk fake news or misinformation. So that's actually good news. This, though, is very interesting, or it's something that you have to think about when discussing activism. 39% really complain about spin and agenda-filled news. So actually lots of people are really puzzled when they can't tell apart what's opinion, what's fact. It's really, really a concern, or they feel like, is the information right, but the headline doesn't quite fit the information, so is there a spin to the agenda? And when you've been engaged in journalism, you know that it's, you know, you want to really do a good headline because your story is of no use if nobody reads it, or you want to have like a catchy whatever image, or so this is really a fine line that you have to walk to make it interesting and catchy, but at the same time not put a spin to it. And actually only 26% say they have been exposed to completely made up news. Now this again is glass half full, glass half empty. Is 26% a lot, or isn't it? It's 1 in 4. Yeah, you can discuss that, but just looking at these numbers tells you something. This is what you can affect. The other stuff, well, there's fact-checking, there's all kinds of things, there's platform regulation, but you can't affect us as much as you can affect your journalism that you really have an authority over. And this is another thing that I find quite puzzling. This is actually from our 2017 digital news report, and we will have something on it in the upcoming one, news avoidance. So if you look at this, that 29% of all respondents actively avoid news. And the biggest share is half of them say the news has a negative impact on their mood. Then we have a problem, really. If people consciously go out of the way to avoid news, we have to do something to make our journalism better, different, whatever. And you all know the debate about constructive journalism, maybe to do a different kind of journalism. And I would really recommend you to look at the stuff that now that news organizations, when they're selling subscriptions, and they look at the conversion rates and what kind of stuff really sells to audiences. This is really interesting what you can find. And it's very often very different from what editors and reporters think people should read and are interested in. Now, that doesn't mean that you necessarily have to sort of cater to all the expectations, because obviously as a journalist you are, you have a task and you have a mission and you have a task to fulfill for democracy. So you have to inform people, you have to make it relevant, and you can't just do what audiences like, like Netflix or whatever, who just go, who likes it best. But it's really important to think about, is the journalism good enough to make people read it and consume it and look at it and watch it? Yeah, and also a big topic is connected to trust is a matter of representation. I mean, this was funny, This is a movie, His Girl Friday. It's about a newsroom. Obviously, it's all guys. That was funny. Newsrooms might have looked like this back then. Is it funny? This is also a newsroom. It's a few years old, but not that old. So there's been a big debate. Do newsrooms really represent society as it is, or do we need to do something about it? And this is a tweet by the editor-in-chief of the Financial Times, Lionel Barber, who got a letter to the editor, and they published it. There's someone who wrote that the FT has no black columnists whatsoever, and that he doesn't feel represented by the FT. And it's a good move, at least, that the editor-in-chief is open about this, posts it and says, hey, look, there's some work we have to do here. And a really interesting story was this one. This is also from the FT. And this is front page news in the FT last year, and I used to work for FT Deutschland, and it used to be a newspaper that was completely catering to like this business clientele, markets, whatever. And then last year, this woman, this reporter, she did this investigative story on an all-male, basically all-male charity event, and she went as a hostess to this charity event, and she wrote the story about how hostesses were treated and how they were propositioned and groped at this event. And actually, this was the Financial Times put this story online the next day, and they put it on the front page. And this was actually the most read online FT story ever. And I'm pretty sure this wouldn't have happened if there were just, men running the newsroom. But since women are getting so much more influence in the newsroom, then it affects the content, really. And if you have a different kind of content, then you get different audiences, you get other readers, and this really been very good for the FT. And yeah, this is a chart we had in our Trends and Predictions report that was published in January, and I just included this, first of all, because I talked about burnout and talent before, but also to show you the last thing about the level of diversity in the newsroom. It's currently a concern, or is a concern for more than half of media leaders. We surveyed 200 media leaders in December, and more than half of them said, oh, the level of diversity in the newsroom is of a concern to me. This was 10 percentage points up from the year before, so it's a rising concern, and newsrooms better do something about it. Yeah, business models under pressure. I won't talk about it too much. I'll just show you that one slide. Because willingness to pay for digital news, for online news, over all markets is 14%. So just imagine, you go to a bakery, you buy bread, and only 14% of people would be willing to pay for bread. That would be weird, In all other industries, willingness to pay is 100% because you have to. So this is a real challenge. It's an uphill battle that journalism has to face. And obviously, willingness to pay is very different in different countries. The best ones, the best performers are the Scandinavian countries, where willingness to pay is really high. yeah, there are really low performers there. For example, United Kingdom with almost the lowest percentage of willingness to pay. Now, very often this is a function of what alternatives you have. If you have lots of competition, and for example, in the UK you have the BBC and they have free quality news available, lots of people feel like they don't need to pay for news at all. Whereas in a country, for example, one of the Scandinavian countries that is also protected by language a little bit, if you want to access quality news in Swedish or Danish or Norwegian, you basically, very many people feel the need to pay because, yeah, if your competitors also has a paywall or a paid model, you basically have to pay. So it's really, yeah, it's really some room for improvement there in many countries. And what helps is actually doing something like this here. Now you're all journalism students, but many people don't even know about the bad situation, the bad financial situation the media industry is in. And we found that the higher media literacy is, the more people know about the situation journalism is in, the more they are willing to pay. And so it's really important to, you know, share these insights and tell people, look, this is, yeah, the news industry isn't as profitable as you might think. Yeah, and since I always like to be a little bit optimistic, on the optimistic side, closer to the end, still let's keep in mind how digitalization helps media and what we can actually do to, yeah, make journalism better and to improve it. It provides you with opportunities in knowing and serving audiences, and that's a very important one. I mean, a newspaper before then, you didn't, if you worked for a newspaper, you didn't know what kind of stuff your audiences were reading and what they were ignoring. Now you have all these insights and you can do something with it. There are opportunities for distribution. I mean, even if you work in a very small market, you do a fantastic story. If you even do it in English, you can distribute it even globally. So that's really important. There's opportunities in storytelling. I don't have to tell you anything about this. Now you have all these different formats, and you will have virtual reality coming up and all kinds of things. So you can do everything much better than we used to be. Data journalism, huge opportunity in data journalism that yeah, when I grew up in journalism was just not available. Opportunities for collaboration. Think about the Panama Papers. That wouldn't have been possible earlier on. An international cooperation is something that's really gaining traction, and that's something, there are big opportunities in there. There are opportunities to professionalize management, and I told you earlier, management used to be not a big deal in news organizations. That's why, you know, great reporters sometimes were promoted to be editors, and yeah, and they weren't really trained as managers, and they did badly. So the news industry is currently really discussing about how to improve leadership, and this is actually why I'm running these leadership programs at our institute, to bring in editors-in-chief and managing editors and senior people from media organizations to really work on their leadership skills and improve their knowledge about the media. There are opportunities in AI, definitely. I listened to this managing editor of a very small Swedish newsroom at a conference recently, and he said, you know, we are a very small newsroom, we're just 25 people, but we will build an army of robots to do interesting stuff that we can do, outsource to robots, so that our colleagues can be freed up to do exciting stories, and the audience can still get the daily, you know, weather reports, sports results, whatever. So everything that can be outsourced to robots, we will. So this is interesting to watch. And this point is really important to me. There is an opportunity for a value debate. Usually a value debate starts to be led once an industry is in crisis. Think about the finance industry, or maybe about even the automotive industry. Maybe there will be some value debate at some point, or think about the whole debate about climate change, plastic, global warming, whatever. So usually if there's a crisis, there's much more room for value debate, and value debates are important because, yeah, we are human, we have values that we want to promote, so we have to really lead this debate. And now this is I think this is my last slide. Tasks ahead, journalism and democracy, and let me conclude here. So what's ahead? Building sustainable business models is probably the #1 challenge, and there was also lots of discussion about that in Perugia this weekend. Investing in quality is important. More investigations, less clickbait, vigilant fact-checking, transparency about mistakes. Journalists can really work at the quality of their products. That really is necessarily important. Rebuilding trust, that's also a function of working on quality, but more communicating better with audience is really important, not being up there on that pedestal and not thinking about what your audiences want, but communicating and developing news with your audiences, and a better representation of whole society, showing the whole picture in the newsroom and in your products. Attracting talent is another one. Already talked about this. Managing the relationships with the platform companies. There's a lot of discussion about regulation currently. The platform companies are sort of a little bit worried. I mean, this is a very, the power relationship is very one-sided. The platform companies have huge power, media organizations, very little. Still, managing the relationship and not doing just blindly everything that platform companies want you to do is really important. Using technology to fight back. This is actually, we just published a new report this Saturday, the News Innovation Report, where a colleague of mine, Julie Possetti, went to newsrooms in, she said, like the global south. She went to newsrooms in democracies, India, South Africa, and the Philippines, where, you know, freedom of expression is a little bit challenged. And these newsrooms really use a lot of technology to fight back, to really, you know, see what to show where the harassment comes from, to really show what kind of campaigns are run against them. So really using technology can be an important tool to fact check stuff so that people don't have to believe everything that's coming from official media, and to show that they're doing the right thing. You can use technology to do that. And then last but not least, managing the AI future. And that's going to be a big task also, because, you know, we all know that we definitely don't want to let the robots take over. There's always people, humans behind the robots, and we have to lead a value debate. Yes, and now let's get to our questions, our discussion. Thank you. Where do you want to sit? Oh, I'll just sit here.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much. A lot of information. I took some notes, but there was a question that I had in my mind. You concluded with the bright side, and I like it. But let's make a step back to the problems, the issues of journalism today. So I'm thinking my generation. I grew up with the myth of the journalist. I'm thinking about Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman in the Watergate scandal, in the famous movie, the two heroes who makes the US government accountable to the world with their investigation. And I'm pretty sure that if I ask to my nephew, she's 6 years old, she already has clear in mind Greta Thunberg. So a girl, an activist, who is now the hero, someone who's bringing this message of changing the world. So in such a messed up world, would you say that, how can journalists can be perceived as the new, as those who can bring change, as activists are now perceived? Because I agree with you, there is a difference between the two, but compared with the past, I don't see many examples of brave journalists. There's a lot of brave journalists, but I don't see many global examples of brave journalists who are making this world better. What do you think?
Well, I'm convinced nobody would know Greta Thunberg if there was no journalism, because I mean journalists are the ones, who amplify her message. I mean, she could, if she wrote just the blog post, if there were no cameras, if there were no interviews, I bet people wouldn't know her. So it's still very important to have, voices. You need the voices, but it's still very important to have the organizations who make sense of these voices, because otherwise she would be just drowned out in a cacophony of voices.
Brings me to a second question. You mentioned a few times artificial intelligence. Okay, so I read about these robots that are now capable of writing articles as good as journalists. I don't believe so, but they are getting closer to that. And there are increasingly platforms with algorithms, web platforms, that promise to activists they could target the population, and they could draft and suggest the best strategy to advocate for certain reasons. So my question is, are we leading to a world where both journalists and activists will be, if not replaced, but still they will have to work with algorithms that will write articles and share information and will also play the role of activists?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, there are two things here. I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing to outsource stuff to robots, because I grew up as a journalist for a news agency, Deutsche Presseagentur, German press agency, and I spent so much time writing, just these whatever really easy to do earnings report stuff that I would have loved a robot to have a robot to write, because I could have spent I could have put my energy and my time much better in interviewing people or leading conversations where instead of just sitting at my laptop hammering away. Or did I even have a laptop back then? I think I did. I'm not that old. It was very different back then, but I mean still. So I don't really, I don't have anything against robot journalism as long as it frees up capacity for journalists to do the real stuff, investigations, or to come up with great ideas, great projects in the meantime, when they're not consumed with doing all the regular routine stuff. So I really like that. If it's a supplement, if it's complementing each other, if it's replacing journalists, obviously, that's a very bad thing for society and democracy. And some publishers might think, this is the way to go, to just have a newsroom run by robots. That would be really the worst. But the other question you had is so much more, this is really interesting about the relationship between journalists and activists. If you have activists who have, artificial intelligence helping them, selling their message the best possible way, well, what's the difference to advertising then? And I mean, I think that's an important thing here. Journalism is not advertising, but some people might take it for advertising. Journalism is still there to sort of have, at least to try to present a different view, to present an opposite viewpoint, to listen to several sides and to help the audience make up their minds by themselves. But if you have just activism and you have certain messages, obviously you can find ways to really sell them to the particular audiences that are most susceptible. But I would think this is dangerous, and that's why it's so important to really do something to protect quality journalism that has certain rules and ethical standards to conserve.
Journalism, can you describe us what it takes to be a qualitative journalist?
Yeah, that's a really tough one. I'm actually the vice chair of the Committee of Quality Journalism in the Digital Age in the Council of Europe, and when I was elected to be that, and I went to Strasbourg for the very first time, and then one in our group said, well, actually, I don't really like the title, quality journalism. And I was like, you know, I used to work for media organizations. I grew up in quality journalism, and I thought, well, that's a no-brainer. You know, what's quality journalism? But the longer I thought about this, actually, the more interesting I found that question was. And in fact, we spent 1.5 days debating what is quality journalism, and I think we're still not done yet, because obviously you can use the label quality journalism also as a weapon or for censorship. You can say, you know, if you're a government and you feel like this is a publication that's too critical and you don't agree with them, then you can say, oh, this is not quality journalism. You know, they don't get a license, or we just say they're fake news. This is not quality journalism. So I've really come, my conviction really is that quality journalism is never a single piece of content or a story or a text or whatever. Quality journalism can always only be a process, a certain set of rules that need to be applied to content and in a news organization, and there are ethical standards that are connected to that. So everybody knows in all big major news organizations there's a lot of bad journalism. So quality journalism and bad journalism are not the same. Quality journalism is something when there's at least some rules, for example, to have second sources for certain things, or to have a second pair of eyes at least to look on something, and you have ethical standards that guide that organization, that journalism, to obtain the best possible version of the truth. I think that's what Carl Bernstein said, or what, I don't know. I can't. Anyway, but that's quality journalism, and it's not a single great story that you enjoy reading.
So, you know that I spent almost all of my week in Brussels. And for years in Brussels, we had this idea that there were, on one side, business companies, powerful with money, that could influence the decision-making, and on the other side, the poor civil society actors without resources that were struggling to be influential. And over the years, now people are starting to realize that there's many civil society actors that can create alliances, then they can build a profitable model that can also be very influential. Now, you concluded by mentioning among the challenges, the market. So how do we make a market of communication and journalism that is profitable? How do you see, what is a model of journalism that is profitable, that is qualitative, but also profitable in terms of resources?
Yeah, I mean, everybody who can afford it or is in the right environment is currently going for subscriptions or donations or anything where the money comes actually from the audiences, from the readers, the viewers, because that's, you know, the best way to make sure that journalism is independent from big, powerful interests. Now, I realize, or you have to realize, that this is not a model that works for everyone. And there have always been powerful individuals owning publishing companies. There have always been, big moneyed interests. Like, think about Jeff Bezos, who bought the Washington Post, and this is probably one of the most progressive and profitable news organizations that there are. I just think that what is really important for an organization is to establish at least some sort of independence and ideally a variety of funding, because the more different sources of funding you have, the better it is to be independent and to order. Or alternatively, I mean, having Jeff Bezos owning the Washington Post, you better make sure that he doesn't interfere with what kind of content you are producing. Now, this is easier said than done, and Marty Baron, the editor-in-chief of the Washington Post, is actually in our advisory board, and he really says, like, no, Jeff Bezos is great, he has never interfered with our content. Then again, well, you can also have this, as a journalist working for the Washington Post, you probably think twice before you do a story on Jeff Bezos and his fortune and whatever, his divorce, that's the latest thing. So it's not even have to do some direct influence. Jeff Bezos probably wouldn't really want to do that, just, walking up to Marty Baron and tell him you don't report on this. But, in the back of their minds, many journalists probably have the awareness. So it's much better if you get your funding from a variety of sources, as the Washington Post also does. Like, you have digital subscriptions. The news organization that does it best currently is the New York Times, with selling digital subscriptions, and that's really where the industry trend goes. Some others might not have that choice, so there might be crowdfunding efforts. There might be, still local newspapers going back to whatever, local advertising or philanthropy. I mean, there are different ways, but getting your money from your audience is probably the safest way to, be independent.
Would you say that the Guardian's model of free access to all content is doomed? It's going to fail?
Well, The Guardian is about to break even right as we speak, after quite a few years of deep losses. And they give you free access, but I don't know if you're readers of The Guardian, you are constantly reminded, if you enjoyed this, please give us your money. And actually that approach works quite well. Interestingly, The Guardian, that is a UK news organization, gets most of its donations, or at least in terms of volume, from the US, where it's also read, because Americans tend to be more generous. I mean, that's a cultural thing. Europeans tend to pay more taxes. Americans tend to be more generous in terms of donations and giving away voluntarily. So this actually works for The Guardian, and that's really important. Every news organization has to look where they're operating in, which cultural environment, or, as I said before, if you're operating in an environment where you're sort of protected by language, it's easier. If you have lots of competition, it's harder. And it also has to fit the needs of your audience. And when you were The Guardian and you told people year in, year out, you can access journalism for free and this is democratic and whatever, then you can't just, it's hard. You could, but it's hard to just, pull the lever and say, oh, tomorrow it's going to cost you. You have to find a way around that, and that's a nice workaround they found. And at least they're breaking even. I mean, are they back on their road to huge profits? Let's see.
I'd like to go back for a second to what you mentioned before about the idea of trust. So during my classes, I try to explain to students how civil society is important for a healthy democracy, but then I challenge them by showing case studies where advocacy campaigns have been based on completely biased information. How can a journalist help that? How can a media professional can help the public to understand where is the truth? In a situation where 29% disengage from news, the other astonishing number, 51%, only 51% believes in the news that they decided to read. So I see the other 49 say, okay, I read the New York Times, but I do not believe in the New York Times. And so how can journalism help that to make the public more aware of where the truth is?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, these audiences might not believe everything that's in the New York Times, which is okay, but they might believe certain journalists or certain sections, like I believe, I trust the science section, but I don't trust so, I mean, that's a little bit, it's always difficult to have these average numbers, but still, increasing credibility is really important. And I think journalists, they just made the mistake for way too long not ever to explain how they go about their work, that there's actually a set of rules and standards that they are following, and that it's not just them sitting in their offices hammering away at their laptops, but that they have to consult second sources, that they have fact checking in case that's available. Many news organizations can't afford that luxury. That they have colleagues who who check their stories, that they have an editing process, whatever. And it really, really helps. And when I was at Süddeutsche, I was managing editor, I told you, I think, and I did a lot of newsroom tours with different groups and audiences, and I was always surprised how little people actually knew about journalism. So it's really a matter of increasing media literacy and telling people how important journalism, independent journalism is, because obviously with advocacy campaigns, activism, obviously activists have to believe in the stuff they're, passionate about, and very often they don't they don't report all the facts because they have a mission, they have to get donations, whatever, so they really have to work hard on that message. But the journalist's job is to sort of lean back a bit, keep a distance, and look into this, does it make sense? Is this really true? Could there be a counter argument? And that's a great value for society, and that's really important. And to make audiences, people understand that there's a big value in journalism is really vital, and I believe in that as a journalist and as a citizen too.
Perhaps we can ask to someone in the public if you have questions.
So you mentioned earlier about the deep throat situation and how, as of late, there haven't been any popular journalists as of late. But I really feel like that there have been many cults of personality within news, like with Wolf Blitzer, Sean Hannity, Rachel Maddow, and I wanted to know about your opinion on a journalist sort of monopolizing on one person and to be the voice for an entire social prerogative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an excellent question, because actually just in Perugia I've been thinking about this, a profession that is sort of run by people, by many people with big egos. Is this really something that we can trust in? And actually, as a news organization, you have to find a balance, because on the one hand, it's good to have your stars, because they attract audiences, they attract readers, listeners, whatever. On the other hand, the individual journalist with the new investigations, data journalism, whatever, the individual journalist is stepping much more into the background. So actually, better pieces of journalism are very often the ones that are that have many contributors, and not just one of these big stars. And actually, it's also hard for some of the big stars, particularly in broadcasting, to really step into the background, because they are so used to be on air and speaking to a big audience in the evening news. But now that there's all this distributed access to journalism, people tend to lose their focus on these celebrities. So actually journalism has to change in that way. And actually the prospect of becoming a famous journalist was probably something that attracted young people to this job, and to see that actually this might not be the future of journalism, but the future of journalism is collaboration, where your own name might sort of get to be part of a group. That might be less attractive for some people, but I think actually it will improve the journalism. It's like in soccer or football, whatever you call it. If you have just a team of stars, very often you don't win a championship, but you win a championship by having a successful team. And I see a newsroom as like that. It's better to have a successful team where people work hand in hand, other than having just a few stars.
I was wondering, to what degree do you think it's journalists' responsibility to promote or influence democracy, and how can they go about doing this without jeopardizing the objectiveness of their stories?
Yeah, that's also a question that's puzzling. Can one person ever be completely objective? Probably not. But you can at least try it. I mean, because if you have in the back of your mind that your task is to inform the public of, the different perspectives on some issue, to do research and to research the different points, different actors, and if you think about the intentions and interests these actors might have, and you try to present them in an objective way, then that's really the best way. And obviously, you'll always have an opinion yourself, probably, and you can arrange facts around that opinion. But I would always aspire to presenting different kind of views and helping to provide just the whole picture to help the audience make up their own minds, because actually audiences are not stupid. And it's a very big danger to underestimate your audiences, because people can read and people can understand the stuff. And if something is too slanted toward one direction, people will get really skeptical, and you will just increase distrust. So the less you try to promote your own agenda, the more people will appreciate it. I'm deeply convinced, because I get very suspicious when I read something that's just black and white. And sometimes the black and white stuff might be a great story, or it might make a great bestseller, but it might not, it doesn't explain the world as it is, because the world isn't black and white. The world has many shades of different colors. And yeah, as a journalist, you have to sort of navigate that.
All right, hello. So my question is, it's kind of related to the article by Habermas Public Sphere, is that because of the modern media and social media, and every people have this kind of easy access to news, including those illiterated people and to those extremists, they can freely comment, they can freely comment on different government policies and stuff. So do you think it's kind of consolidating the formation of fake news because of the lack of individual ideas by the people who are reading them, which form this kind of fake news? Because whatever you tell people, they already believe it. They believe what you said, every single word. And that, do you think that journalists have this kind of obligation to educate people who read those news using the tight logical interpretations in these news, and et cetera, et cetera? Do you think it's the obligation of journalists, or it's the obligation of these people that are those readers, those common citizens who read the news, to educate themselves?
Well, someone has to do the educating, and it's not only the journalists. I think it's journalists can contribute, but it's also a matter of schools, of universities, other organizations to increase media literacy is really important. And we all know what you were talking about, this confirmation bias, that people look at stuff, and then if it's, if they feel it confirms their own prejudices, then they tend to believe in it. So two people might read the very same story and come to very different conclusions. So that's a tough one, because there's also research on this. If there is fake news, if there's misinformation, and you tell people this is wrong, and you repeat the lie or the fake news or whatever, then people might believe it even more. So there's actually, don't ever share misinformation, don't ever share lies, because you just amplify it, and people tend to do that. But there's neuroscience, lots of neuroscience out there in terms of how you understand news, and there's much more research to be done on that. I think it's really interesting. But as I said before, audiences are not stupid, and actually what we find is that very few people share fake, in comparison, in relation, very few people actually are exposed to misinformation, very few people share it. Most people really steer clear of it, because they have this sort of skepticism. They feel, oh, Hillary Clinton running that can't be true, that's just stupid. With some things, it's less easy to tell, but many people feel like, oh, this is I can just ignore it, that must be fake news. then again, I mean, I found this myself, that particularly at times when this discussion about fake news, or about misinformation and lies was so intense, you know, I'd look at stuff in my news feed, and I felt like, oh, you know, could this be true? Is this right? Is this wrong? Even with, you know, good information, and that's something, it increases distrust. If the debate is so loud and all encompassing, you feel like, oh, you know, you call into question even stuff that you've taken for granted before. So let's be careful with that debate.
As you've already mentioned before, like there is a common belief that journalism is nowadays in crisis. And during the conference, there were a lot of perspectives on what media may look like in a couple of years. Like some say there is like, it's going to be short narrative, others say it's going to be long narrative, others like, oh no, no one is going to read in a couple of years, we're just going to watch videos. So do you have your own perspective on that? What do you think it's going to look like?
Our findings are, and I mean, that's not only our findings at the Institute, but we found that also at Süddeutsche Zeitung. There's no limit to the length of a text. Well, there is a limit, but actually very long stories are consumed completely, whether they are online or, well, in the newspaper, you can't tell, but it doesn't really, there's really no insights into length of text that's acceptable. If it's a great story, people will read it, even online. So it's not just, you know, online short stories work and long stories don't. In terms of video, text, interestingly, there's a difference between, for example, the European or American markets and the Asian markets. In the European and American markets, people still really, really prefer text over video. That's a very clear result. In the Asian markets, Asian audiences really prefer video, and they'd love to have more video. And now with podcasts coming, I'm sure we'll have interesting results on podcasts, because it was a huge, it's been a huge trend last year and this year. So maybe people will go back to the audio part, but there's still a significant proportion of people who really like to read and who prefer text. And you can see that in the whole book market. I mean, the expectation was once you have ebooks, you know, people won't buy books any longer. People are still buying books. The percentage of ebooks is sort of leveling off at 1/3 of the market. So what we have is, very often we don't have replacements. We have shifts in attention, but everything starts to exist next to each other. And then that's the same thing, you know, when TV came, people would still listen to radio. When radio came, people would still read newspapers. You have much more choice these days, and you have a variety, and you can read your newspaper when you're, you know, at home in the living room on weekends, but when you're driving your car to work, you might listen to a podcast. So there's lots of choices, but I believe that all kinds of different ways of storytelling will exist, and I strongly believe what doesn't work is this complete multimedia, all-in-one kind of product, because people are tired of distraction, constant distraction, because, you know, you have all this distraction to begin with. You have your smartphones, you have all different news from your family, you have your news feeds, you have this and that, and then you might want to. People got tired of this, or they are increasingly getting tired of this. So reading a text can be very relaxing because you're not distracted. Listening to a podcast, people enjoy that much more than currently than watching a video and doing, you know, different things, because it's just, they can just focus on listening. So it's really, that's the success of the podcast, is that people feel, oh, this is not distracting. So I'm sure that non-distracting formats will gain a lot of traction. Will this be in 10 years? Will we have virtual reality in 10 years? Will we have whatever? I don't know. Who am I to tell you? You'll find out.
Hi, so the Google News Initiative is kind of this example of where tech and journalism cross, and it's kind of been a big help in making the news more accessible and consolidating news sources. So my question for you is, what is the role of platforms such as Google or Facebook in the future of journalism?
That's a good one. I did a panel on this in Perugia. You can watch it if you want to. I mean, obviously, the role of platforms is tremendous. I mean, I told you already, because they control access to news, and actually they have shaped a lot of what newsrooms are doing in terms of funding too. You mentioned the Google News Initiative. Many newsrooms can't experiment, and they don't do innovative tech products without money from the Google News Initiative. Süddeutsche Zeitung, I used to work for, we had the policy we wouldn't take money from Google because we wanted to keep our independence. That was an option for us because it's Germany's biggest quality newspaper. We could afford it. Many newsrooms can't. I just advise, or that's what I also said in Perugia, I just advise everyone, if you take money from these platform companies or if you work with them, think in advance how this is going to work, how this is going to affect your independence, how this is going to affect your reputation, and in particular, what's going to happen if they withdraw the money, because this can happen anytime. And I can tell you our institute has a pretty big Google grant, so we have this digital news report that's partly financed by Google, but actually it has, I think 13 or 16 different funders are involved in this. So if Google pulled out, we could still survive as an institute. We would have to shrink a little bit, but we could still survive. And if you take money as a newsroom or whatever as a research organization, you should always make sure, first of all, that you have a variety of funders and a variety of income sources, and not just one. Don't rely on, someone cut this off. The time's up. Hello. Okay. Thank you. That you don't rely on one, and then if you set the terms of engagement, just make sure that you can act independently, and also that you don't sit there once they pull out and you have to shut down everything. I mean, that's really important. I mean, there's a whole list of things, but these are the two important things.
Hi. I sat in on a panel about EU regulation at Perugia, and Jeff Jarvis, I don't know if you're familiar with his work, he was the creator and founding editor of Entertainment Weekly. He reinstated a new definition for journalism, and I wanted to know if you wanted to add anything. He said, journalism is to convince communities to engage in dignified, civil, informed, and productive conversations. And I was wondering what your opinion is, or if you'd want to add anything to that definition.
Was that the panel with Paul Nimitz from the EU Commission? I sat in
Yes.
the same one. Yeah, that was a really good one because they had different viewpoints. Yeah, I wouldn't object to that. I mean, it's a little bit academic. It's a very long definition, but obviously journalism is there to help citizens, to provide citizens with all the information they need to know to be citizens, and also to engage with them and foster a dialogue among citizens. And it's a great learning effort to help us all learn more, and we learn more when we engage together and not in this one-directional way that we used to engage before as journalists. So yeah, I wouldn't object to that.
This is kind of going off of what Sophia was talking about. So I know you were talking a little bit about how certain groups will prefer audio, podcast, or visual representation, means to access news. But I was wondering, in your opinion, what form is kind of the best to preserve democracy, if that's even possible.
the best form of storytelling, or I mean, it's really, it depends on your audience. What's the best forum? I mean, if you have, you know, if you reach people best through text, then, you know, that's great. And we are talking about this new trend, you know, voice, you know, is voice engaging with the internet through voice? Is this a new form, and is this really democratic? Because, you know, you don't need to be able to read and write, and in many countries there are still a lot of illiterate people around. So if you can't read and write, currently you can't really engage too much with the internet. But is this the future? Then again, if you just interact with the internet by talking to some smart speaker, will we actually lose the capabilities or capacities to understand complex text? And is that something that's really important for us and for learning? I just went to the Uffizi galleries yesterday, and I just thought about this, like, are we actually still able to paint like this, like, you know, people used to be so many hundred years ago? Or have we actually de-learned this this ability? And are we, now that everybody's taking just pictures, I mean, there's millions of pictures taking photography, taking pictures of these paintings with their smartphones, and is this actually a skill that's redundant, or was this important for democracy, or is it just now being replaced by different skills? I think it's really interesting, because the way you transmit information also shapes the way people think. So what's the most conducive to democracy? I don't know. I still think conversation is the most conducive to democracy, and it is important to foster conversation that's, you know, healthy, basically non-threatening, and helps to engage as many people as possible. And how you do this, how you create spaces for conversation. There really needs to be debates about this. And now with all the discussion about internet regulation, and how it's actually really about how to create safe spaces for conversation. And I think conversation is really at the core of democracy. So the better you really create these spaces for conversation, the better democracy will be served.
Well, I guess, first of all, since our time is running out, first of all, let me thank you for coming here. It was very, very interesting. A lot of insights from two words that are not that different, in my opinion. The journalism, the activism, there are differences, but many things are that have in common. We've been mentioning talent, education, storytelling for democracy, definitions, big players' roles in journalism versus those who do a daily job without being necessarily famous. If you will have to give a piece of advice to someone who would like to start a career as a journalist, what would you suggest?
Very easy. You have to really want it. Don't expect to get rich financially, but expect to have an interesting life. And I'm absolutely sure you'll make it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.